Alright guys, so in this video we're going to go ahead and take a look at the Arcade1UP NBA JAM cabinet. Now this is going to be the one that you would pick up from a Walmart or the only available version here in Canada, and I'm going to give you guys my thoughts. This is Steve from Restalgia, and let's get started.
How about I give you a little BOOMSHAKALAKA? Here it comes!
Fight.
Alright guys, so welcome to the channel. If this is your first time here, please consider going down below the video and subscribing as we work our way towards 30,000 subscribers. So I just mentioned that this is the version of the Arcade1UP cabinet that you would purchase in the US at Walmart with a retail price of $3.99. And what that means with this version is you are not going to get the NBA JAM themed stool, as well as no LED deck protector in this bundle. Additionally, I did mention this is the only version available here in Canada, so this is what we get and this is what I get to work with. Now what we're going to do is we're going to start talking from the ground up, so we're going to take a peek at the riser first, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this thing, but I do want to say that they did a good job with the artwork surrounding the riser itself. They've kind of gone with a basketball print logo, and then they've also got the NBA JAM logo right up on the front, as well as NBA logos on the sides. Now I do want to say it is a little bit strange when this thing is assembled to see the NBA logo both on the riser and up on the actual main unit. They kind of look a little bit out of place, but there is the possibility of having some sort of licensing agreement where those logos needed to be displayed on both units, and maybe this is the best way that they could do it. Building the riser is really simple. It only takes about 15 minutes or so, and really you don't need the instructions. It's pretty self-explanatory. Now moving along to the NBA JAM cabinet body, we're going to look at the side panels first, and I will say I do like the style they've gone with. Obviously we have kind of like a basketball print, and then we do have the beautifully large NBA logos printed on both sides. Both left and right panels are going to be mirror images of themselves, and it just really is a nice, clean, sharp look. The front panel is the generic Arcade1UP style with the 3 included games printed directly on it. So we get NBA JAM Tournament Edition, as well as NBA JAM Hangtime. The screen is a really nice bright BOE monitor. They've been using this more or less on some of their newer cabinets. We saw the same monitor on the Star Wars cabinet, and I think this is going to be the new standard moving forward because it does output some really nice bright colors, and it's just a pretty good quality monitor. And then finally, we also have the light up marquee, and this is something I think Arcade1UP has been spot on with. I absolutely love these marquees, and I'm going to show it off in action in just a little bit. Now assembly, super straightforward. Build quality has definitely improved since earlier versions and earlier waves, but there are still some issues. For example, I wasn't able to use all the dowels that you would need during assembly, and that's simply because the pre-drilled holes weren't actually wide enough in some of the spaces. It's really a small issue, and the dowels don't really provide any structural support. They just make assembling and lining things up much easier, but this is still something you really wouldn't expect to see on, in my case, a 630 Canadian dollar cabinet. Now having a peek at the rear of the monitor, we're going to see something that stands out really large, and that's going to be a really big obnoxious Wi-Fi antenna. And this is actually really surprising to me as to why they needed such a large antenna, especially considering, I mean, this technology is not new, and they really could have gone with a wired antenna for the same or possibly even a cheaper price point. That being said, it is inside the cabinet. It's not an eyesore in any way, and it really isn't a big deal. But I do want to say that this cabinet, when it's fully assembled, set up on the riser, is really an eye-catcher. Arguably, this is one of the nicest looking cabinets that's been released to date by Arcade1UP, and at a minimum, it is definitely in the top 3 visually for sure. Now when we get this lit marquee on, it really does give a nice glow. Nothing obnoxious, nothing distracting in any way. It just suits the cabinet and really adds to the overall look of the machine. And moving forward, Arcade1UP needs to continue to include these with all of their machines. It is absolutely a home run, and it just adds so much wow factor to any of these cabinets. The control deck is another thing that I really love. I would have loved to see hands-on what the light-up LED deck protector would have looked like in person, but even without it, the design is on point and everything flows and matches the rest of the cabinet extremely well. Cabinet design is definitely a really strong point for Arcade1UP. The controls are Sanwa clones, and they're okay. I mean, they're not my favorite. I don't mind the sticks, but I'm really not a big fan of the buttons. I personally find them a little bit mushy. I feel like there's a little bit too much travel before the micro switch is engaged. This isn't overly noticeable in local play, but it is something that's going to be more apparent when we start getting into some of the online play. And again, this is also kind of a personal preference, so you may not agree with this, but that's definitely my standpoint. But in terms of actually getting set up to play online, it's actually pretty easy. Connecting to Wi-Fi is super easy, very straightforward, but this is where that archaic large antenna actually starts to make a little bit more sense. So Arcade1UP decided not to use a dual band Wi-Fi chip on their board. I don't know why they would have done this, but what this essentially means is you can't actually connect to a 5G network. You're going to be bound by a 2.4 gig signal, which is okay, but it is incredibly limiting to your download and upload speeds. Mind you, this game doesn't really send large packets of data for online play, but it does still feel a little bit silly to not have included an advanced Wi-Fi chip in here, since they are the going standard in 2020. After Wi-Fi setup, you just got to grab a username, tie it into an email, and you're pretty much ready for online play. You can jump right into it. But before we get into that, I do want to talk about the main navigation menu. Arcade1UP partnered with CodeMystics, who is essentially responsible for all the emulation on this device, including the front-end UI. These guys also did the Arcade1UP Star Wars cabinet, and if you saw my review on it, you know it was and still is, in at least my opinion, one of the best cabinets that's ever been released. CodeMystics set up the ability to access dip switch settings for each game. This is going to include things like adjusting the game difficulty, and another fan favorite would be something like big head mode. But the main navigation menu is really clean, really straightforward, and if you want to play local, you just simply select the game icon of the game you want to play. And if you want to join an existing online match, you just choose a match from the existing current games in the right-hand column. Local emulation, though, feels really good. They hit this right out of the park, and it feels pretty clean, almost like you're playing on the original cabinet. Everything does feel really good that way. Now, I said I didn't particularly like the buttons, but they do the job and don't really hinder gameplay that much, but in all fairness, I'm not really good at these types of games regardless. Now, like I said, emulation's pretty good. That being said, there are still a couple of things that some people are not happy about with the cabinet. The first thing is going to be the roster, and I'm sure you guys have heard this before with a few other reviews and some announcements that Arcade1UP's actually made that they are missing certain characters. In my opinion, it's not really that big of a deal. Now, keep in mind, I was really young when this game was released, so I'm not really familiar with a lot of these players. What I think people are more upset about is rather than finding some sort of a placeholder like a mascot or a different character to put in, they ended up duplicating characters on the same team. So if you select those teams with a missing character, you end up with two of the exact same characters, even though one of them has the appropriate attributes. The second thing I've seen a lot of people being upset about is the replacement of the power switch. And there's probably a couple of reasons why they did this. One, because they're using the same switch as the volume control, they can essentially order more of those and they don't have to purchase two different switches, probably bringing the overall cost marginally down. But additionally, because we are dealing with some more advanced hardware, we do have to keep in mind that there are specific shutdown procedures that need to happen in order for the cabinet to shut itself down, and when you've just got a straight kill switch, that'll actually prevent that from happening. Another sweet feature that we have here is the ability to access a bunch of the hidden characters when you enter in different initials or birthdays or pins or anything like that, depending on the game that you're playing. Keep in mind that some of the characters, like the Mortal Kombat players, were removed before the revision of the ROM they are using, so you don't have access to them, but there are a ton of really fun and awesome players to use and unlock. But the gaming experience begins to change a little bit when you get into some online play. Now, I dedicated quite a bit of time to playing online so I could really get a handle of how this feels before I made my review. Now, keep in mind, the online play is a major selling feature of this cabinet. Now, don't get me wrong, the experience really isn't that terrible or even really bad, but I do want to point out some of the issues that I personally experienced. First is going to be input delay. I know there's going to be people on both sides here. Obviously, when you have online play, you're going to have input delay. The problem here is that the cabinet was developed using a peer-to-peer networking system. So this essentially means that during online play, one person is going to be hosting the game while the other players are going to connect directly to that cabinet through some sort of an online communication server of types. Now this has a ton of benefits, including things like quick connecting and in perfect conditions, very smooth gameplay. The problem here is that we almost never have perfect conditions. Essentially, your connection to the game is literally only going to be as good as the weakest link. Some other YouTubers have mentioned connecting in an OTG adapter or a micro USB to Ethernet adapter into the data port on the back of the monitor to enable a wired connection, and this is really great if you want to bypass your slow Wi-Fi speed, but this essentially is a moot point if any of the other people you're playing aren't also connected in the exact same way. You could have the absolute fastest internet speed in the world and be hardwired in, but if your opponent is connected to a shoddy Wi-Fi signal, your game's going to stutter and it's going to crawl regardless. The solution here moving forward is to implement a dual band Wi-Fi chip into all future boards with Ethernet built in as well. Another issue with the current online system is that it can actually take a pretty long time to connect into certain games. Now, for the most part, you're able to connect in within seconds, and that's really great, but other times I was sitting there for like a minute to 2 minutes just trying to establish a connection. Now, I can say for certain it definitely isn't my network, wasn't my speeds or anything, and to be fair, this is completely solvable just by hitting the live button on the control deck, leaving the session and trying a different game. But by far the biggest issue I've had with online play is the way that Arcade1UP has handled bailouts. And if you don't know what I mean by bailouts, it's essentially when you're playing online against another person and they decide for whatever reason they want to jump out of the game right in the middle of gameplay or towards the end of a match. So if you are in the middle of a game and a live opponent leaves for whatever the reason happens to be, the player they were controlling essentially becomes a dummy character. They don't do anything on screen, they just stand there looking like a doorknob. The game at this point more or less becomes unplayable and you have to leave the game, or you can just try to wait and hope that somebody new who's joining the game will take that player's space. This is especially frustrating if you are leading a game and somebody decides to jump ship just because they don't want to add an L to their record, and they can do this with absolutely no penalty. The cabinet is connected, so if Arcade1UP wants to fix this and you're listening to some feedback, please push out an update that will, 1, penalize players for quitting a game early, and in my eyes that would be an automatic loss on the record, but also converts those dead players back into CPUs so the game is still playable and you can just finish that match. Now, I will say that I have spent a fair amount of time playing on this cabinet since I assembled it, and I do very, very much like it. I think this is a really, really great first attempt at a Wi-Fi enabled cabinet by Arcade1UP, but they will still want to fine-tune some of the online emulation and consider updating some of that hardware to make online feel much more streamlined in the future. And even with all the hiccups I mentioned in the video, this still ranks as probably one of my favorite cabinets so far, which is actually saying a lot because I'm not really that big of a sports game fan. But that's pretty much all I've got for you guys. Let me know in the comment section below what you guys think of this cabinet. Is it worth picking up? I want to hear from you. Consider giving the video a thumbs up if you liked it, or a thumbs down if you didn't. Thank you so very much for watching, and I'll talk to you guys again real soon.